The following Kellogg Insight podcast is brought to you by the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Whether you're looking for knowledge you can apply at work or a topic that will spark your creativity, Kellogg Insight is your destination for the latest ideas from Northwestern's top business faculty. Early in 2008, the federal government reacted to a slowing economy with a $100 billion tax rebate program. By the 1st of July, more than 70 million households had received an average rebate of $950, which lawmakers hoped would go right back into the economy. Kellogg professor of finance Jonathan Parker and co-researcher Christian Broda wondered if that was true. With the help of A.C. Nielsen, Parker and Broda were able to tie the arrival date of those checks to each taxpayer's actual spending patterns. And not only did they find that taxpayers started spending those checks in a timely way, early results show that the rebates might have prevented an even more serious downturn in the retail economy. And now, writer Lisa Holton talks to Jonathan Parker about how short-term economic stimulus plans affect consumer behavior.
Hi, Professor. In 2008, the federal government responded to a slowdown in our economy by mailing or direct depositing something like $100 billion to 130 million U.S. families and individuals. Skeptics argued at the time that Americans really wouldn't spend that money. However, your research indicates otherwise. Let's start by talking about what got this started.
Well, I'm a macroeconomist with a longstanding interest in macroeconomic policy, and also I have done a lot of research on household spending and saving behavior as it pertains to national savings, for example. The genesis of this particular research started in 2001 with my work on the 2001 tax rebates. And when President Bush was first taking office and he and Congress were putting together a tax reform package, the tax rebates became a central part of it. And this tax rebate program, which was designed to head off or mitigate the 2001 recession, had a historically unique feature. This feature was basically that they were trying to send out $66 million in tax rebate checks. And they couldn't send them out all at once. And so they decided to smooth out the mailing over 10 weeks. And because they thought it would be unfair to send some people their rebate early and some people their rebate late on the basis of something like age or region in which you live, they tied it to something that was basically random, the second to last digit of the Social Security number. And now we had a randomized treatment where some people would get rebates early and late, and that didn't depend on any other observable or characteristics of the household or the tax filer. And so what we could do is compare the spending of the people who got it early to the people who hadn't gotten tax rebates yet, and see whether their spending rose relative to what they were spending before and relative to what other people who hadn't gotten their rebates yet were doing. And this allows us to distinguish the effect of the rebate on spending from the concurrent macroeconomic factors, which had always been a difficulty haunting previous research.
Let's fast forward to 2008.
So in 2008, we saw a similar law passed, and again, we jumped into action. So the previous research I did with Nick Soulelis and David Johnson, and I'm doing similar research at this time now for the 2008 package, but it relies on a government survey. The government conducts to create the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and understand inflation dynamics. And it's not specifically designed for studying consumer spending, but we were able to use it then, and we'll use it again now. What I'm doing now and actually have preliminary results on is uses a different set of data to examine the same features of the tax rebate program that we were just talking about in 2001 that have been echoed in the 2008 program. What we're using now is a data set created by A.C. Nielsen, their home scan data. And what A.C. Nielsen does, as you probably know, is they monitor how people see in movies and what records and books they buy. They also have a panel of households who report to A.C. Nielsen what they actually buy almost in real time. They're given barcode scanners at home. So like when you go to the supermarket and you scan in, the food scans through to get the price, they have a barcode at home and they have to do it again when they get home. They scan in the things they buy, and they're reported then electronically almost directly to A.C. Nielsen. And what that means is that they have a large panel of households, something like 100,000 households participate reasonably regularly in this collection of spending data. And what we did was we worked with A.C. Nielsen to ask households, survey them as to their rebate or economic stimulus package in this case, receipt, how much, when, and are they expecting it. And so now we can do a similar thing. We can look in May and halfway through June, which is the data we have so far, and see whether the people who've received their rebates have increased their spending relative to those who haven't received rebates yet but expect to receive rebates. And again, economic stimulus payments.
Right.
Really.
What's interesting about this is that if you read any news report, people are thinking that the economy is in a down state, that people aren't spending, that people, that this particular stimulus package and the rebate has had no effect. What did you find?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, if you look at the aggregate numbers, you see retail sales slumping in the last couple of months and being very low. And so one would conclude, if one were just looking at the aggregate data, well, we've mailed out rebates and spending is low, nothing's happening, they're not working. But in fact, what we find is that someone who's gotten a rebate has increased their spending by 3.5% relative to someone who hasn't gotten a rebate and yet is expecting to get a rebate. Again, economic stimulus payment.
Yeah.
So that seems to be at least an initial evidence of quite a bit of spending. Now, we're only able to track people for 5 weeks after receipt so far in the data, but we'll get more data and we'll be able to tell more later. But this is evidence that there is a spending kick from the tax rebates that are coming, that is coming now and is helping maintain retail sales. So why are retail sales slumping? Well, our research suggests that it would have slumped a lot more if it hadn't been for the economic stimulus payments.
How did this shake out demographically?
Well, it turns out we can also do some cuts as to see who spends more. So let's compare now only low-income households who got their rebates now versus a low-income household who hasn't got its rebate yet. It turns out that households in the bottom third of the income distribution, roughly, spend at about twice the rate of households in the rest of the income distribution, meaning that their spending jumps by 6.5% when they receive a rebate relative to a similar household that hasn't yet received a rebate. And it's similar if we cut by asset level. If you say, do you have enough savings set aside that you could maintain your standard of living for a couple of months without any more income? If the answer to that is no, those people tend to spend their economic stimulus payments at much higher rates.
Is there anything to be said about the fact that you get low income, low asset spending up in this kind of economy? I mean, some people would say people who have more money and might have been getting, who knows, maybe an even greater rebate might have had more effect. Is there any distinction there that we can make?
Well, the low-income households may be a little more concerned about the current economic situation. They may be facing more job loss prospects. They may be the ones more inclined to be saving and cutting back on spending. And so an economic stimulus payment like this may make them do that less. Or some of them may actually be facing job loss or the like, and an economic stimulus payment may be very helpful in terms of maintaining standard of living. And I guess the final thing that you see in this situation is dramatic increases in cost of living. Not dramatic, but significant increases in cost of living in basic necessities, so food and gasoline being the prime examples. And so again, an economic stimulus payment could be used to maintain spending on other areas in the face of increasing prices of food and oil.
So I think a lot of people think that when the federal government sends you a check in the mail, it's automatically going to go to a new TV, maybe a little bit better family vacation, something like that. But in this case, you can clarify this. A lot of the spending might have just been going to essentials simply because the prices, basic cost of living was going up.
Certainly, that's quite possible. I mean, what we observe in the actual data where we're looking at spending, there's some evidence that people spend more of the rebate relative to their usual spending patterns at supercenters, meaning things like Target or Walmart or stores where you can get kind of large amounts of stuff cheap. We also asked people what they think they're spending on, which is a slightly different question because you could put your rebate payment and spend it on oil, but really what it's doing is maintaining spending in other areas. And the responses actually there showed across a wide range of goods that people thought they were spending their rebates on.
And from an economist's perspective, basically, as long as they're spending,
Well, that was the goal of the policy, was to try and maintain spending levels and in a precipitous collapse of consumer confidence.
Okay. One of the things that we had talked about earlier was sort of the overall state of the economy and sort of the emergency situations that the Fed, the Treasury, other departments are dealing with. And obviously, if I'm interpreting it correctly, you have this one-time stimulus action that was sort of laying a floor, or at least a safety net under the consumer spending. I mean, long-term, is this a policy that we could see used again and again?
Well, monetary policy remains probably the main and primary focus of economic stabilization. It can adjust smoothly. It has a long history in the United States of keeping its focus on long-term issues and sort of managing to squeeze in economic stabilization at the same time. Fiscal policy has a whole set of political problems. The last two, the economic rebates of 2001 and the economic stimulus payments of 2008, have been timely, well done, one-time things that have worked reasonably well. There are also a lot of what I would call automatic stabilizers in the economy that act a little bit like rebates. Things like unemployment insurance, which send out more money when more people become unemployed in a recession, and therefore help to maintain spending in a recession. And something like that doesn't require legislative action. It isn't potentially, politicians go to Washington and try and deliver money to the home state. And sometimes they care about sending money before elections rather than after elections, which is not necessarily good economic policy.
It must have been tough to get this up and running because this is sort of a real-time economic crisis we're talking about. How did all that work?
Yeah, well, from the point when the legislation was passed and it became clear again that in 2008 we were going to have some randomized component to policy, that it would be fantastic that if we could use to learn about policy, to the time when the checks went out, there was a very short window of time. And we had to set up funding, basically, to conduct a large survey of households to find out about economic stimulus payment receipt, timing, and amount, even among the home scan households. So what we were very lucky was that Kellogg provided backup funding support, and then there was a granting agency, the Smith-Richardson Foundation, that could reasonably quickly process this. And so with some other fundings from things like the Zell Center and other places, and Smith-Richardson coming through, the Kellogg backup funding wasn't even needed, but Kellogg supported the research from the get-go, and that was crucial.
Well, that's great. And obviously you were able to jump on this very, very quickly.
We did, and the home scan, the AC Nielsen folks deserve a lot of credit also. They have in place a very nice system for conducting and collecting the expenditure data from all their households, and then also some survey technologies that they're often using with private companies who are interested in evaluating whether their sales or promotional activities are working or why customer loyalty is fading and things like that. And they also now are starting to work with academics on research projects that are very helpful and are, I think, adding to knowledge about economics more generally.
It's interesting to me because obviously universities work very closely with government researchers in many, many projects. But do you get the sense that the government is certainly their appetite is whet for this information as far as they really want to see more and more of this kind of data?
Well, certainly in our case, the previous study we did in 2001 was referenced by Paulson and Bernanke and others when they were trying to pull together this particular policy. And they were trumpeting both that it needed to be timely and temporary, as well as the fact that we had found that, for example, low-income households tended to spend more. And so there was some push to target more low-income households. And in fact, in the 2008 legislation, 30 million households who wouldn't normally file tax returns were included in getting the economic stimulus payment and were encouraged to file tax returns just to get a stimulus payment. So that's how far down the income distribution this particular economic stimulus payment went.
You've got data still coming in the door at this point.
Yeah.
So what else are you going to find out?
Well, our central interest is, are the spending increases going to get larger or smaller from this economic stimulus package, and how long are they going to last? So economic policymakers are interested in that because when you conduct an economic stabilization package like they're doing, sending out tax rebates, they want people to spend it reasonably quickly, and they want a fairly large bang for the buck. They want a lot of spending to come from it. Because that's the goal of the policy, to try and maintain spending levels. So what we want to know is, how long does that last? Businesses are perhaps also very interested because we're looking at the Christmas season and a lot of spending coming down the pike. And so what they want to know is, are we going to have slumping retail sales in October and November and December, or are things going to pick up? So those are the key question is length of spending impact. So what we found in 2001 was that within the 3 months in which the rebate arrived, then people spent about a third of the tax rebate and about another third in the next 3 months, although there was a lot of uncertainty over that. So what we're hoping this time is to get a much more precise estimate.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people have already gotten their checks, and is it possible to track, say, by the end of the year, the end of the Christmas spending season, whether that really is going to have an impact?
Well, our hope is to see whether it does. So, for example, a lot of people are going to turn around and first thing they're going to do is deposit their check, or they're direct deposited in their account for them, and they'll think they're saving it. And then what happens is, come the Christmas season, they're going to turn around and check their account balances, find out that they have the money to spend, and perhaps spend a little more. So we'll have to see what the data show in terms of when the spending occurs and how much gets done. In previous research that I haven't done, but people have tracked credit card spending. And so if you look at people who have very high utilization rates on their credit cards, and when that person gets a tax rebate, you see that the credit card utilization rate goes way down. So they pay off a bunch of credit card debt. But then 9 months later, that credit card spend level is about, again, 90%. Sort of if you take a cut where the person starts at about 90% utilization rate, they end up at about 90% utilization rate on average. And it's all because of higher spending rates, not higher payoff of the debt. So the people actually over the 9 months spend a lot of money on these credit cards.
And from a consumer aspect, that's probably a very negative finding. But from an economic standpoint, it's all good, right?
Well, from the macroeconomic standpoint, what we'd like is people perhaps, this might be indicative, for example, of someone who has self-control problems over the use of credit cards and the use of debt more generally. And so they have good intentions to pay it off, but end up still with high levels of debt, or their economic circumstances have remained bad. From a macroeconomic standpoint, what you'd like is to see these rebates spent if you send them out to maintain spending. The idea is if people spend, they keep people employed. People who stay employed keep their spending levels higher, and we get a less severe or mitigated recession. Again, this is a policy that we hope works in temporary demand-driven slowdowns and should not be pursued as a year-to-year basis. What we need in the longer term is higher saving rates, not higher spending rates.
Right. Do you think that consumers, ordinary taxpayers, are going to be expecting this as sort of an infusion as we go into tougher economic times? Do people have long memories about these sorts of things?
Well, there is something of a concern. So the economic stimulus payments, the letters you may remember, said this is a one-time payment. And they were very explicit about this being a one-time thing. Certainly year after year, we're not going to see it. The question is, at any hint of an economic slowdown, is the policymaker now going to feel pressured to send out a tax rebate when perhaps it would be better if just the Federal Reserve handled the thing?
Well, say in a few years we're in the midst of another recession and you're going to be researching it. Do you see any changes to the process?
Well, there is some concern that from a researcher's perspective, the future economic stimulus payments, if there are any, will be harder to evaluate. So in 2001, they mailed out all the checks and they did it over a 10-week window. 10 weeks gives you some hope of distinguishing the first week from the last week behavior. This time around, nearly half the economic stimulus payments were direct deposited. And since direct deposit is not as difficult to send out, you just push a button somewhere, as sending out a check, they did the direct deposits, half of the economic stimulus payments, over only 3 weeks. It's very hard to see any difference in spending patterns from someone who gets it 1 week versus 2 or 3 weeks later, especially when some people are probably only seeing the payment or noticing it when they look at their account statements, although the government did send letters in each week at the same time to let people know they were being direct deposited. But the thing that we're using to identify the differences is the spread in time between when one person gets it and another, and that seems to be becoming smaller. So it may be difficult to do future research evaluations of these programs. On the other hand, the benefit of this is that they're getting out much more quickly. So the government is becoming more effective in getting the money out into the economy more rapidly.
And so the government probably will not be doing this kind of spread of payments in the future.
Certainly seems to be getting less and less, or far fewer households were covered this time as a percent of the total rebates mailed out than in 2001. And if that continues, it'll be difficult for a researcher, although perhaps much better for policy.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor.
You're very welcome.
The Kellogg School of Management develops global leaders who make contributions of lasting significance for the world. Learn more at kellogg.northwestern.edu.